Test, test. Hello out there. Nerd Nite. Hi, Nerd Nite. Can everybody hear me okay? Hey, we're here. It's February and it's 55 degrees outside. It's amazing. Spring break, yeah, 55 in balmy southeastern Michigan. So, you're here at Nerd Nite with us. Thank you so much. This is Nerd Nite presented by the Ann Arbor District Library, and we have awesome speakers lined up for you tonight. We're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to have drinks. We're going to learn things. It's going to be great. We're on to the next slide. I want to tell you before we get into our speakers who will be talking about these things, a little story about how Nerd Nite came to be. So this is Chris. He's, at the time of this picture, a grad student in Boston, and this is his second home, of course, Midway Cafe, a bar in Boston, where night after night he talks to anyone who will listen about his research interests, which take him across the world to Cameroon to study this little guy, this adorable little bird, so angelic. It's such a cute little bird. The indigo bird is what it's called, except it's not so cute. Actually, it's a jerk bird. A jerk bird. Why? Well, because these little guys will lay their eggs in other birds' nests, and when their babies hatch, the babies, destroy the other eggs and then get fed by the hapless, unsuspecting other bird species mother, and then repeat the cycle over and over again. So these indigo birds are interesting parasitic killers that Chris talks about night after night at the Midway Cafe until the bartenders are like, Chris, enough. Okay, we've heard this story in thousands of permutations night after night. You get one more chance. Okay, we're going to clear the schedule. You're going to get up on a mic on the stage, and you will tell your story one last time. Okay, and then invite your friends, your enemies, and then we'll be done. And Chris did that, and it was so much fun that everyone said, hey, we should do that, but with other people's stuff. And so Nerd Nite was born. Yay, yay, yeah, we can do a yay for that. And Nerd Nite spread all across the land, and of course we have one here. Ours is the best, though, because it's hosted by Ann Arbor District Library, us. My name's Lauren, by the way, and my co-host Emily you saw at the door. You'll see her later. Yeah, okay, oh. Yeah, and let's give it up to Live, too, for hosting us. They're amazing, and tip your bartenders well. And thank you for coming out and being the amazing, friendly audience that you are. And special thanks to our speakers, the first of whom is Samuel Friedman. So he's going to be talking to us about safety. Buddy is next. He will be talking about total eclipses, not to be confused with the other kind. And then Joseph will be speaking about two-dimensional materials. So you can read the rest about their titles right there. Yeah. Okay. So without further ado, Samuel, let's welcome Samuel Friedman. Yeah. Give it up. I don't want to say too much about his bio. Just come on up, Sam. You're a two-time graduate of the University of Michigan, and you're going to talk about safety. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Good evening, everyone. My name is Samuel Friedman, and we're going to talk a little bit about safety. I know I have to hold the microphone closer. I apologize. So, just going to say this really quickly before we get into anything else. Normally, when I speak, I don't have a spotlight on me, so it's a little bit different. This presentation is not advice. This is not legal advice. It's not any advice. I don't want to hear anything about this from any of you after this. This is just a very quick and short look into the world of safety. There's a lot here. It's a little bit disjointed. I have a lot to cover. I am going to say a lot of funny jokes. I do expect you all to laugh. The information is only applicable in the United States. I don't really know very much about the rest of the world in regards to safety. So that being said, my name is Samuel Friedman. I'm the Safety and Occupational Health Manager at the VHA in Ann Arbor. That is the wrong photo. I have a degree in electrical engineering. I have a second master's in engineering management. This is my full official title. I really like it. Look how many lines of text it takes. It's like the full slide. It's great. So why does my position exist? What is a safety manager? Well, my job is to ensure the safety of all employees at a business or a job site, specifically for me, the VA in Ann Arbor. OSHA is the law. There's going to be a lot of acronyms. OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They are based off of the OSH Act of 1970. When I say OSHA is the law, I literally mean it is the law. Michigan OSHA says it very aptly. It's educate before we regulate. There is no compliance. You will comply. It's just this kind of comply or don't comply and get fined and then comply anyways. So OSHA is this nebulous term people, sorry, I knew this would happen. OSHA is this nebulous term people use all the time. People like to say that they get into OSHA violations in their house or whatever it is, their garage, you see that a lot. OSHA does not regulate your home. They don't care about you, the individual. And a lot of businesses, similarly, are not regulated. There's a big asterisk there because that's not exactly true. I'm not going to get into it. But OSHA is just, they really look at businesses, not you. So why does my job exist? Well, people really like to get themselves killed. 2,500 people last year in the United States died to preventable workplace accidents. That's 34 people in the state of Michigan, about 50 on average per state. And a lot of these, when I say preventable, I truly mean preventable. So these are two snippets I stole from Michigan OSHA. This is all public information. The second one here, the gentleman kind of decided to go underneath a bobcat, one of the kind of machines that have the big bucket, and while it was running, the bucket was in the air and decided to work underneath it. It did not work out well for him. He did, in fact, die. So that's why my job exists. So this kind of common sense stuff sometimes isn't so common. These are the top citations for OSHA in the last year. So 2023, 4 of them you'll notice are fall related, and we'll get to that. So number 1, fall protection, as I said. Number 2 is hazard communication. It is every employee's right to know, fundamental human right to know what hazards they are exposed to in their workplace. It's a very real thing, and it's number 2 on OSHA's list. Number 3 is ladders. We'll get into that. 4 is respiratory protection, talking about silica, asbestos, COVID. And then we have scaffolding, back to fall again. Lockout, tagout, LOTO. This is a huge thing. I am not going to talk about it. That's like a whole presentation in of itself. People don't comply a lot. It's problematic. And then look again, fall protection. And then eye and face protection and machine guarding. It's actually an OSHA violation. If you're using tools, if your company is having you use tools outside of manufacturer's recommendations, like you're using a grinder with no guard, that is an OSHA violation. So, as I said, we're going to talk about a few of these. It is your right to know the hazards that exist in your workplace. When I say PPE, I mean personal protective equipment. It is the obligation sometimes of your employer sometimes to provide you with this PPE. And this will be stuff like asbestos, silica, hazardous chemicals, bloodborne pathogens. Your workplace should let you know if you're going to be exposed. And if they don't let you know, that's a violation of the law. Additionally, if you are exposed, it is your right to be able to file an accident report, to file workers' comp. That is quite literally the law. So please keep that in mind. Want to talk about respiratory protection. Respirators are PPE, and they really do work. I can't stress this enough. When we hand out PPE, it's for a good reason. Respirators, when you're trained to use them, do work. Interestingly, though, mold is not a regulated substance. It is organic in the way that we all have different exposures to it. I have a very high tolerance. Some of my coworkers have a very low tolerance. OSHA does not regulate that. Some states regulate that. New York State is a good example. They have a very comprehensive mold standard. Michigan does not. So kind of a fun fact in there. Talking about masks. So N95s, we're all familiar with them now. What does the N stand for? What does the 95 stand for? Well, N, R, and P, or rather NP and R, all have to do with the resistance to oil vapors. So N95s, as we wear every day, don't have anything to do with oil vapors. You're not going to be provided them unless you need them. So as I said, N is not, P is partial, and R is resistant. And then 95 is actually 95% effective against particles 0.3 microns or greater. You can also get an N97, and that is 97%. And then an N100 is not actually 100%, it is 99.97%, and those are what we call HEPA filters. So a little bit of fun information here. Lastly, on respirators, N95s don't work. These are pet peeves of mine. That's why they're in here. These are just things that have been bothering me for years now. N95s don't work if you have a beard. The whole respirator situation has to do with a seal. If you can't get a good seal on your face, it's not gonna work. Also, it's a respirator. That's like a very important distinction. One of those face masks that you get, they're not respirator. A respirator will restrict your breathing. There have been numerous cases of people having heart attacks from wearing an N95. It does happen, and you need to be trained on how to use them. Most KN95s are no more effective than a regular face mask. Most of them are fake. The K stands for China. It is very true. That is literally what it stands for. It's the Chinese standard of N95. Now, if you were to somehow come across a KN95 that was legitimate to the standards that they said that they are, that would be fine. But there's no way of proving that. It's very hard to get Chinese manufacturers. They will always say that they are, but in reality, they're not. So a NIOSH approved, NIOSH is the organizational body, it's over there. One of those face masks approved by them is the real deal. If you are interested in protecting yourself, the best thing you can be doing is wearing one of those cloth face masks that is snug to your face. Regular face mask will protect others from you, but there is a lot of leakage around the sides. That's really what we're talking about here. So that seal is really important. Anyways, so ladders. Why are so many people falling? Four of the top 10 have to do with fall protection. It's crazy. People are dying all the time, especially ladders. I have a pet peeve. Ladders are extremely dangerous. I cannot emphasize this enough. If you're going to use a ladder, do it correctly. If you're going to do it correctly, actually do it correctly. Because you can put up a ladder and do all the right stuff. This little graphic here is very real. If I see anyone at the VA or anywhere in my district on a ladder, the second to top step, you're off the job for the day. I don't want to hear it. You get talked to. If you're on that top step, you're off the job, and we're going to have a very long we're going to have a very long talk about why that's not allowed. Ladders are serious business. Most people here probably know someone who injured themselves on a ladder at their house. So if you are going to use them correctly. And if you have PPE provided for you to be wearing, wear your PPE. It is extremely dangerous. Ladders kill like hundreds and hundreds of people a year occupationally. That doesn't include at home. So we're going to jump over to fire codes. I know I said there was going to be a lot of jokes. It's not really. Safety is a serious business. So fire codes. Fire codes are kind of the rules on how we do everything regarding fire safety, really. How your buildings are built, what kind of materials you use, the containers we have, and how to maintain those systems. So there's the point I'm trying to make here. So as you already saw, there's Fire Code 1 and then Fire Code 2. And I guess, the tricky part about fire codes, and they're very encompassing, is that there's actually 3 of them. And when I say 3, I actually mean there's 13 of them. And then when I say actually 13, there's 52 of them. And then the reality is there's 420 different fire codes. There's a ton of them. The 2 that are most important day to day, for me, 99, which is hospitals and healthcare facilities, and then 101. 101 regulates buildings like this. So any residential building, any commercial building is going to be covered by 101. It is I don't want to say gold standard, but it is the most encompassing NFPA standard out there. And I thought this would be fun. I took a little walk before we got here. How many fire code violations are there? I saw 3. I saw 3 violations that I probably would cite at the hospital. But the reality is that fire code citations in general, a lot of them are very similar to being pulled over for having your blinker out. There's so many of these. There's 420 separate codes. You will be guilty of something. There is no world you can walk through a building, even if it's just built. A fire inspector should be able to find something. That's just the way these things are. It's an invitation. So, I don't think there's any major. I'm not going to actually tell you any. No, it's free advice. So back to 101. It's really an exciting document. What can I say? They talk about square foot per person. They talk about how many sprinklers you need. And you're sitting through all of this. I know you are. And you're all wondering to yourself, Sam, why do modern buildings suck so much? And that's so good, because that's the question I have on the next slide. And the answer is fire code. Fire code is why Fire code is why our buildings are so lame these days. You don't see buildings like this anymore. You don't get any buildings where you have the ladders on the outside. We don't do that. We build buildings in compliance with fire code, and I'm gonna ask, where were these photos taken? No one knows. This could be Ann Arbor, this could be Denver, Colorado. You see these buildings everywhere, and the reason you see them everywhere is a lot to do with money, but also because of fire code. Fire code says that this is the cheapest way to build a high-rise building. They call them 5/1s per IBC, the International Building Code. So you get 5 stories of wood over 1 story of stone. That means, according to fire code, it's safe, which it is. Fire code has been refined over the years. These buildings are safe, but the reason they look like this is because they are safe. It's much more expensive to build stone buildings. It's much more expensive to build high rises after a certain point. So that's why we are ending up with so many. You see them all around Ann Arbor, and this is why. It's fire code. Moving on in this disjointed presentation, we're going to talk about safety concerns. These are things I see all the time, and these are things you probably will never see the same ever again. You can thank me after we're done in the questions and comments. I would love to hear about how I have ruined all of your days. So. Doors being propped open is a huge thing. Fire doors, you see this all the time, especially in the hospital. People love to prop doors open, whether they're moving things in or out, rather. You know, just kind of general, want airflow, things like that. Doors are smoke barriers, and some doors are fire doors. They are rated to contain fire. Containment is a big thing in fire safety, and this is a really good graphic that I pulled from online. This was a house fire, residential fire. And you can see going into the room that the rest of the house was on fire, has totally burned out. Behind the door, the bedroom is undamaged. Now, I can see there's a lot of smoke in there. It's not all undamaged. There's a lot of smoke damage, but it's much better to have your stuff not burned than to have it all in ashes. So there was a building fire last year in Brooklyn. 34 people injured, 17 people died. And the reason that fire was able to spread so much is because the door on the apartment did not close. So because it did not close, the fire was able to spread to the rest of the building. It was a really big deal. If you Google Brooklyn fire, this will be the first result. It was a major investigation, and it all started because of a space heater. So this is something that no one ever talks about. This is really important. I think if you go to Home Depot today, or Lowe's, and go buy, or actually Stadium Hardware, we support local businesses. If you were to go and buy an extension cord, $5, you're gonna get something that's not even on this chart, probably 18 gauge. And because of the way that American units work, 18 gauge is actually smaller than 16. So the problem is that space heaters are a good example. They pull 15 amps of current, usually, 1,500 watts of power. This handy-dandy chart says anything that's 14 gauge or lower is suitable for that. 16, 18 gauge are not. No one's going to tell you this. You can go and buy this cable all you want. Home Depot's not going to stop you. What will happen, however, is if you start pulling 15 amps through an 18 or 16 gauge wire, then this will happen. The copper's not going to melt. Copper has a very high melting point. The plastic on the copper, however, does not. That plastic will then leak onto your carpet or your floor. It will be on fire, and next thing you know, you have a building fire. That's how that Brooklyn fire started. It was just like this. All extension cords, if they have those tags on them, if you haven't ripped them off, they will say what gauge they are. Generally, they print it on the body of the thing as well. Good thing to check when you go home. Digging holes. This is something that I see a lot of. OSHA has an entire multi-week course about this kind of thing. Don't dig too deep of holes. That's really what it comes down to. So anything under 5 feet is OSHA regulated. So if you go to the beach, you see this all the time. I mean, this is a headline. These are 3 years of headlines that I pulled up. You see this every summer. Someone wants to dig a really big hole at the beach. I understand. Trust me, we've all been there. But the reality is, once you get under a certain point and that hole collapses on you, it only takes about 2 feet or less of dirt to stop you from being able to breathe. So if you're under 5 feet, good luck. It's a really quick way to die. This is a really fun talk. So just be careful if you're digging too deep of a hole. Excavation is a serious topic. We deal with it a lot, especially in construction, and people get trained in it. for weeks at a time. You have safety experts who should know better, and sometimes they don't. But that's why people like me exist. Anyways, next topic, CO leaks. I highly suggest everyone go buy a CO monitor if you don't have one. Put it in your furnace room, wherever you have any like fire. This is an event that happened last year. Sorry, I keep forgetting about the microphone. This is an event that happened last year in Ann Arbor. Or actually, it happened 2 years ago. The citation came out last year. A maintenance worker went into an Ann Arbor hotel, like boiler room, took a few steps, passed out, died. There was a huge CO leak. No one knew about it. They got cited big time by OSHA. And actually, I remember when they got there, when the fire department got there, it was so severe that they evacuated the entire hotel. CO is serious business. And it's not just something that happens like one-off. You don't see it that much anymore. But everyone, I don't know if you know Weird Al Yankovic, the comedian. His parents both died from a CO leak in their house. They were laying on their couch having a fire, and there was just a CO leak, so they fell asleep and they did not wake up. This is something that will happen to anyone. It can happen to anyone, so please be careful and buy a CO monitor. Lastly, ladders. This is a short snippet. This is like page 1 of, I think, 15 of people I pulled last year that died from ladders. Unbelievably dangerous. It's such a quick way to die. If you can avoid using a ladder or hire someone else to use a ladder so they can be injured on your behalf, then absolutely do it. They are very dangerous. And I think that's it. The last item is actually wear your PPE. This is a huge one. I know it sounds kind of silly. I cannot stress enough how often I don't want to say prescribe, we're not doctors, but we give PPE to employees to wear. We expect them to wear it, and they don't do it, and then they get injured. You are not actually, generally the Department of Labor is not going to side on your half if you're not wearing your PPE appropriately. And one more note on this. I know we have, since this is in Arbor, usually a very high medical crowd in this audience. If you have a bloodborne pathogens exposure, if you get a needle stick or a blood or a sharp like that, there is a very bad culture about reporting these things. And everyone always says, nothing's going to happen. The papers show the incidence rate is very low, and I'll be fine if I don't do anything. That is true. However, I would also like to note the incident rate is low. It is not zero. We had an employee last year contract HIV from a dirty needle stick. Thankfully, we live in the future. They were able to get the medication they need. The only reason they were able to get that medication is because they reported it. So please report those things. And that's actually all I have. Any questions, comments, concerns, or accusations? For bears? They generally will prescribe you bear spray. Otherwise, run. This sounds a lot like advice, huh? 3 feet is kind of a lot. I generally would say if you, anything waist below for a person is fine. As long as you're in the hole and you, aren't compressing your chest. If this hole collapses on you, it's not going to be too hard to get out. But if you're, in the hole proper, or if you, for some reason, decide to go head first, don't do that. So, just kind of stay chest above the earth. One more. OSHA doesn't, so no. The short answer is no. OSHA is not in charge of your house. OSHA is in charge of your employer. So you as a at-home employee would have occupational exposures based on your working at home, but the short answer is no. That's it.
Wonderful. Let's give it up for Samuel. Thank you. Right, yeah. I think I got that. Never use an extension cord, never dig a hole, never use a ladder, and I think don't have fun. Okay, good, yeah. Well, speaking of which, I'm going to take a few deep breaths. I don't know how you all are feeling. That was awesome. Thank you, though, Samuel. That was great. Let's take a break, and we'll see you back here in about 10, okay? Great.
Wow. This is an impressive crowd that I can tell wants to learn because the microphone wasn't even on, but I stepped up here and a hush flew over. And I know it is because we have been beautifully prepped by music cues to learn all about the total eclipse that is happening. And I have great news for you. We aren't just hearing from an eclipse enthusiast, but in fact an expert, because tonight we have Buddy Stark coming here. And yes, yay, Buddy. Who rightfully has a lot of fans because he manages the planetarium at the U of M Natural History Museum, which is about the coolest job out there, I am pretty sure. He is an expert. In fact, he has his master's degree in science education. And yes, normally he is educating school groups of children, but how cool to be educating a group of grown-ups in a bar. So join me in welcoming Buddy to teach us all about the total eclipse.
Thank you all. That was a hopeful applause. You don't know how lousy my presentation is yet. So I changed it's self-deprecating humor. Don't worry. It's pretty good. I changed the title slightly to Get in Line, Nerds, mostly because, get on that line, right? Get on the line isn't quite as catchy as Get in Line, Nerds, so I went the other way. It's also worth pointing out, the only thing I'm going to be talking about is the sun, and as long as you use sunscreen, it won't kill you for another 5 billion years or so. So breathe a sigh of relief that's what we're talking about. And what I'm going to be doing tonight, this evening, is trying to convince you that it's worth a day of your life to go see this in person, right? Not just watch it on a live stream or catch some video or photos or what have you, but actually take the time to go see it. So I'm going to be doing a couple of different things throughout the talk to try and convince you of this. One, I'm going to be telling you a lot of things that you already know, things that are pretty obvious to most of us. And two, I'm going to be trying to convince you that there is a difference between informational knowledge, academic knowledge, or intellectual knowledge, and experiential knowledge, right? A lot of us are very familiar with. We're very fortunate to live in a time where information is super easy to access, right? Anything you want to learn about, basically, you can just go learn about it, right? And you don't need a whole lot of resources to do it, just a computer, and you're pretty well set. But there is a difference between reading about something, learning something in a classroom, reading it in a book, and all of this is great stuff, right? You should do all of those things. And then actually seeing it and getting sort of an intuitive sense of what's going on. And one of those experiences that is worth the time to actually have as a human being is to watch a total eclipse. So that's what I'm going to be trying to do. Before we get into all of that, a little background about me. This is actually my 4th planetarium. I started as a student operator in Strickler Planetarium. I briefly managed the planetarium in Midtown Detroit at the Michigan Science Center. I spent about a decade managing the planetarium in Flint, Michigan, called Longway Planetarium, which is, very good. Do we have some fans of Flint? Very good. Wonderful, yeah. It's a wonderful facility. If you're ever up in that neck of the woods, genuinely, it is beautiful. It's worth your time to see a show there. It's also the state's largest planetarium, which is kind of cool. And now I'm at another very beautiful facility. The admission to the museum is free to the public, so if you haven't seen the new Natural History Museum, take a weekend, right? Just make a trip, have a family day there on the weekend. They have a lot of wonderful exhibits. Stuff like this you can just walk in and walk around and see, right? Mastodons, Majungosauruses, you name it. Lots of other stuff as well. Okay, if you missed the eclipse in 2017, so there was a total, I think most of us are aware, there was a total eclipse in 2017 that passed all the way through the country, and I can kind of excuse you if you didn't get to see that one, because from around here, that's not a day trip, right? Like, that takes some planning. It's like 8-hour drive, or you have to plan a flight. A hotel room is involved, right? So if you weren't able to get the time off work, like, I totally get it. This one, we are very close to the path of the eclipse, right? So like this is where Ann Arbor is. And to be clear, so in order to see, I guess I should back up. In order to see the total eclipse, just to make it really clear, you have to be on that line, right? Like just to make sure everyone's aware of that. If you're not on that line, what you're seeing is a partial eclipse, which is fine, but it is not nearly as cool. And one of the risks, I think, around here is people are going to see that Ann Arbor is like 98%, almost 99% coverage. Like it's almost a total eclipse. So why bother driving like an hour and a half or in traffic on that day, probably like 3 or 4 hours, right? Because it's going to be crazy trying to get onto that line. Why bother when I'm getting like 99% of it here? And this is one of those times when 99% is not at all the same as 100%. And so it's definitely going to be worth just, this is Monday, April 8th. It's 2 months away to the day today. And it's going to be worth taking one day off of work. That's a day trip, even with the crazy traffic, right? Go down first thing in the morning, experience this, come back in the evening. You don't have to have any more planning than just that. Okay, starting with some technical stuff. This is where you're at. If I can't convince you of that, then there's not a whole lot of hope for the rest of this talk. But I point this out because crucially, you're not here. This is, of course, Jupiter. This is actually a couple things actually. So first of all, I was going through my slide deck and I was making sure that I was citing everything, all the images correctly. If it's a space image and it doesn't have a citation, let's just all safely assume it should say NASA JPL down there, right? If we can just, I was like 85% of them had the same citation. So anyway, this is a wonderful image. This is one image. That's one of the things I really love about this picture is that this is a Cassini spacecraft image, and that is Io, one of the moons of Jupiter, in the same frame as the planet of Jupiter, which is just amazing. This isn't like a composite or anything. Yeah, it's really cool. It's not actually that close, of course, right? Like it's behind Jupiter. Hopefully that goes without saying too, but it is still a very close moon to this planet. And the reason this is bears mentioning when we're talking about eclipses is because this thing orbits Jupiter very, very quickly because it is super close to that planet. It goes around Jupiter once every 4 days. Right, so twice a week, basically, this thing orbits Jupiter. And because it's so close to this behemoth of a planet, every time it goes around, there's a solar eclipse, a total solar eclipse on Io. Every 4 days. If you were living on this moon, you'd have problems with volcanoes. There's a lot of those. But you would also, you could set your weekly calendar by whether or not there was or wasn't a total eclipse. And they would last several hours on that moon, right? You'd see them all the time. It'd just be part of your life. The same thing goes for this. You're also not on the moon of Phobos. Phobos goes around Mars even faster. This thing is going around an entire planet 3 times every day. By this time tomorrow, Phobos will have gone all the way around Mars 3 more times. And again, because it's so close, this thing also gets solar eclipses every single time. 3 solar eclipses a day if you're on Phobos. Another thing, and this isn't really, well, it is kind of related. This is a picture that I found, there we go, during my sort of hunt of the topics of this kind of stuff. And this is an image from the Perseverance rover on Mars. This is Phobos passing in front of the sun. This is a solar eclipse from another planet, which is just kind of a cool sort of view. And Phobos is much closer to Mars than our moon is to us, right? But Phobos is also only about 17 miles in diameter. And so it's actually, you can imagine how big or how close this thing must be to Mars to look that big in front of the sun, right? Again, 17 miles is not that big of a thing, but it's much closer, so you still get a pretty big shadow, although you never do get a total eclipse on Mars. And this is the first thing that we all know intuitively, which is that things that are closer to you look bigger. So that's pretty straightforward. And that's important for eclipses. This is why your hand, which is 4 inches across, right, like a 4-inch diameter hand, you can hold it up and you can cover a 900,000-mile sun in the sky, right, because your sun is so much closer to your face. That's pretty intuitive stuff. So let's talk about how this works using some math, which I know is everyone's favorite thing. Well, actually, in this crowd, it might be everyone's favorite thing. I don't know. But so the angle in degrees is related to 2 things. We're not going to work through the whole equation, but it's related to 2 things. It's related to how big the thing actually is, and it's related to how far away it is from you. It's pretty straightforward. There's some trigonometry in there. But some good news for anyone in the audience that is not a huge fan of math, some good news is that you can actually get rid of the trig. If the thing is sufficiently far away, you can make a pretty good estimate of how much of your viewing angle it takes up just by dividing the size of the thing by how far away it is. And so this is important when we're talking about eclipses because we can do this kind of math to figure out how much of the sky the sun takes up and how much of the sky the moon takes up. And the sun, you can see where it's like 860,000 miles in diameter, and it's like 93 million miles away. So it takes up about a half a degree or so in our sky. The moon is 400 times closer, but it's also 400 times smaller in diameter, that is. So it actually takes up about the same degree in our sky, right? It's about the same size in our sky as the sun, which is a crazy coincidence when you really stop to think about it. We have two things in our sky that are not remotely the same size in actuality, but because of their different distances to us happen to work out, they look to us as though they're the same size in the sky, which is already pretty wild. Now, when we have a total solar eclipse, it means that the moon covers the entire surface of the sun in the sky. And does anyone see a problem with my math and my numbers here? Yeah, very good. Yeah, we did the math there, very good. Yeah, the sun apparently is bigger than the moon in our sky, and so that's a problem. And so this is my first example of knowledge that I promise all of us in the room already have. We've been taught the answer to this apparent problem. It looks like the moon should not be able to cover the sun because it's smaller. And you already know why this isn't a problem. It's just that that knowledge for you is intellectual, right? It's something that you were taught. And that kind of knowledge is kind of difficult to apply unless you already sort of know the answer. It's difficult to pluck that situational knowledge out and sort of apply it to any given context unless you know that you should. Because we haven't really internalized it in a meaningful way, and it's not actually super intuitive to us, again, unless we've really given it a lot of thought. And that is that the moon's orbit is not a circle, right? I was giving you average numbers here, but it's not always the same distance away. Right? Sometimes the moon is physically quite a bit closer to the Earth, and other times it's physically much further away. It's also true of the sun, too, at a lesser extent, because the Earth's orbit is closer to a circle than the moon's orbit, but they vary, right? So the reality is that the sun sometimes is a little smaller, sometimes a little bigger in our sky. Same thing goes for the moon on a larger degree, and so sometimes the moon is big enough to cover the sun. Other times the moon is not big enough to cover the sun, and so we get different kinds of eclipses because of this. Last October, if you were living on the west coast of the United States, you would have seen what's called an annular eclipse. Sometimes the moon lines up perfectly with the sun, but because it's too far away from us at that moment, is not quite big enough, and we get an annular eclipse, or a ring of fire eclipse around the sun. What's happening in a couple of months is a total eclipse of the sun, which that wonderful song gave us some hints to. That was very clever. And what happens there, the reason you want to see a total eclipse is because this is the only time in your life where you're going to get to see the corona. So this here, notice that it's not in this image, right? There is like this hair-like structure coming off the surface of the sun that's normally invisible, and that is plasma that is millions of degrees streaming off the surface of the sun. That's what you're seeing there. And normally the photosphere of the sun is so bright that it blocks your view. Even though it's here, this part of the sun is too bright to allow you to see it. And so the only time we get to see that ever is during a total eclipse. And so it's going to look like that. It's also worth pointing out, this happens, or this should happen, it seems like. This is another example of knowledge that I promise you all have. And I kind of gave it away with my next slide there. But this should happen every month, right? The moon goes around the Earth once a month. And so we have a full moon in January. We have a full moon in February and March, etc. We also have a new moon. Right? So it seems like the moon should also block the sun every single month when it goes around. And so that's another example of knowledge. Well, yeah, of course it doesn't actually happen, right? And so that's another example of knowledge that I promise, someone taught you in a classroom, in a book, etc. You know the answer to this already, but it's difficult to immediately drum that up unless you already have the answer, which is that the moon's orbit is not in the same plane as the Earth's orbit. Right? As the Earth goes around the sun, if you like filled in that orbit with this hypothetical blue square, you could have a plane of material, and then the moon is not always in that plane. So the Earth is going around like this, right? There's my fancy Earth going around. And then the moon, if you zoomed in, is orbiting at an angle. So sometimes it's between the Earth and the sun, as far as we're concerned. Like, we would still call this a new moon, but it's sort of a little too low. And so the shadow of the moon misses the Earth. Sometimes it's a little bit too high, and so the shadow of the moon misses the Earth, right? Other times, it lines up just right. It's kind of our Goldilocks thing here. And notice that the orientation of the moon's orbit doesn't change. The left, from this perspective, the left side is higher the whole time. Higher here, higher here, higher here, higher here. So there are some times when it does line up just perfectly, and we get a solar eclipse. Here's another thing that's not super intuitive. How often do solar eclipses happen? At least if you looked at this chart, how often does it look like they should happen? Twice a year, and they do. There, somewhere on the Earth, there is a solar eclipse every 6 months. Like that's a fact. It's not always a total solar eclipse. A lot of times it's a partial solar eclipse, but they happen every 6 months. The reason that doesn't feel right to you is because you don't experience that. I don't know about you, but I didn't see 2 solar eclipses this year. And that's because you have to be in a very specific place. A lot of the Earth is water, so a lot of these things happen over the Pacific Ocean. You're not going to see that. If you're not in Asia or Africa or Europe, when those happen over there, you don't see them. And so for it to happen where you are is pretty rare. If you refuse to budge, if you just stand still and say, I'm going to wait for one to come to me, a total solar eclipse will happen about every 370 years where you are, right? So you're going to have to travel a little bit, and an hour and a half is not too bad. It's about as best as you can hope for, unless you're my parents who live in Southern Illinois, and they've gotten 2 in their backyard in 7 years. So what are you going to do? So, yeah, that path. Yeah, look at, my parents live there. Literally their backyard. Isn't that wild? Lucky jerks. Okay. But it is nice because I do get to go visit them when this happens, and I just go in their backyard and watch this stuff. Okay. So for my talk today, I've told you a lot of stuff that I can't help you with experiential knowledge. We know in our heads that Mars is out there. It's a real physical place, right? Like, I'm not surprising anybody. Jupiter exists, and if we really wanted to as a species, we could go there and visit and what have you, but you and me probably can't get that done. Same thing with the Milky Way, right? This is a collection of stars. We're going around one of them. There's 300 billion stars here. If you're trying to picture that, the best I've come up with is 20 school buses filled to the brim with cupcake sprinkles. That's about 300 billion cupcake sprinkles. That's how many stars you're looking at here. That's kind of a cool fact, and it's going to hang on with you for tonight. But again, like, it doesn't really mean a whole lot to us, right? It's the best I've got. Same thing with this. This is a deep sky image of the universe. Every dot in this image is a galaxy that we've mapped. So it's one more of these, right? And all of this stuff, for the most part, I think most people in this room already knew that, right? We know that we're on this rock, like, again, it's knowledge that we know. We're on this huge rock, orbiting the Earth, or orbiting the sun. We're going out, and we're traveling through space at millions of miles an hour. Right now, you in this room, we know, no one's impressed by this, right? But it's true, and we all know this. The problem is we don't feel it, right? Like, nothing is moving. We're not moving at millions of miles an hour. We're all sitting perfectly still in our chairs. We don't feel that happening. If you actually go and see in person for yourself a total solar eclipse of the sun, perhaps for the first time of your life, you're not just going to know that, but you're going to feel like you're out in space orbiting this star and you're hurtling through the universe. It's a very cool experience. Thank you. Sure. I have time for questions. Yeah. It's April, so yeah. If you really want to like hedge your bets, go to Texas, because you got a better. It's not great. Like, the odds are like 60% clear in Texas, as opposed to like 50% clear in Ohio. But yeah, if you like to hedge your bets. Oh yeah, I made some assumptions about some basic knowledge, right? So it actually, partial eclipse you should never look at. Basically, the rule is if any part of the sun is visible, any part of the photosphere of the sun is visible, you cannot look at it without the help of solar eclipse glasses, which you can buy by the time it gets close just about anywhere you go. You can also pick them up at the museum if you'd like to support the university museum. But during totality, this is another cool thing about seeing the total eclipse. At this stage, you can safely look at that with your eyes, right? Because the corona is not bright enough to damage your vision. The only trick, and the caveat to that, is that you have to know how long totality is going to last where you're standing, because it's going to change depending on where you are. And the thing that makes eclipses so dangerous is that while this happens, the sky gets fairly dark, right? And so your pupils start to dilate. And so if you're still looking at the sun when the moon moves away, now you are looking at that crazy bright sun, and also your pupils are wider than normal. And so that's why it can be dangerous, but that is safe to look at. So it depends on where you are, which is why people will talk about even on that path, you want to be somewhere near what they call the center line, because on the edge of that path, it's only going to last a few seconds, but towards the center of that path, it can last as long as about 4 minutes or so. So yeah, it really depends on where you're at. So look up your location. Decently close, yeah. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but that's kind of how far away I'm going to be from the center line where I'm going in Southern Illinois, and I've got a little over 2 minutes of totality, so that'd be a pretty good viewing spot. Yeah, in the back. Yep. They freak out, yeah. Yep. Yeah, it really is. Yeah, I caught this in 2017. That's another thing they don't tell you is that wildlife freaks out because they don't expect nighttime at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So that's kind of a fun part too.
Thank you so much to Buddy. I've got a plan for us, folks. We are going to empty out those school buses of the sprinkles, and then we'll just all road trip there together. So let's work on that. But before we do, let's take another break. So you've got 10 more minutes. Get another drink. Make sure you take good care of your bartenders tonight. They are working their tails off. And we'll see you in 10. Welcome back, folks. I hope you've made all your travel arrangements, but I hope that you're still open to learning some new things because I'm super excited to learn about whatever two-dimensional materials are. And we are very lucky because we have another expert here tonight. Joseph Essman is a PhD candidate in applied physics here at U of M, but he specifically studies two-dimensional materials at ultra-low temperatures. So what a cool, specific thing that we get to all learn about. So please join me in welcoming Joseph.
All right, is the mic close enough? Terrific news. Okay, so my talk today is titled Two-Dimensional Materials with the alternate title, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Do Physics Like a Third Grader. So, before I get into that, I'm going to introduce myself a little more. So I'm a fourth-year PhD student in applied physics. I study in a field called condensed matter physics, which is basically just the physics of materials. So if you've ever used a computer, that exists because of condensed matter physicists. And I started out in Missouri. I lived in Texas for 4 years, and then I came here, and I was going to have a joke about Michigan winters. Unfortunately, this is not winter. So that part didn't work out, but we're gonna press through. So, little outline for us. I'm going to start by talking about what graphene and two-dimensional materials are. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about the history of graphene in particular. And then I'm going to talk about why two-dimensional materials are extremely weird and how that's cool and arguably in some ways useful. So to start off, I want everybody to think of something very thin, and then somebody or many people shout out the first thing you think of. Okay, so almost everybody said paper. And paper is fairly thin, but frankly, paper's putting up rookie numbers. The real money is in the pencil. So let's talk about graphene. Graphene is a material that is just a one atom thick layer of graphite, the same material that pencil lead is made out of. It's over 10,000 times thinner than paper because it's an atom thick. And it's basically just a honeycomb pattern of the element carbon. It looks like that if you zoom in very, very close to it. And some little fun facts about graphene. It is, for one thing, if you are just pulling on a single sheet of microscopic graphene, it is the strongest material that has ever been measured. It's also very bendable. It's also electronically bizarre, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later. But first, another thing we need to talk about is graphene is not alone. It is part of a wider class of materials called two-dimensional materials, the siblings and or cousins of graphene. So basically, the rough definition of a 2D material is that it's a material that is one or two or a small number of atoms thick. The line is very blurry, but most of them are like 1 or 2 or 3 atoms thick. There's hundreds of different 2D materials that are out there, and they can take all sorts of different forms. Some of them are going to be metals, some of them are going to be insulators, kind of like rubber. They all have different patterns, they're made of different elements. So we have these nice diagrams, but it might help a little bit to look at what two-dimensional materials actually look like in practice. So I took a picture of graphene with my lab microscope, and it looks like this. And this does not help a whole lot. So you can see there's a purple background here. It's very nice. We see a lot of purple in our lab. And it might help if I outline the piece of graphene there. So that slightly different shade of purple is graphene. As you can imagine, the thinner something is, the more transparent it is. And if something is 1 atom thick, it's really damn transparent. As far as the scale of this image, this graphene is about as long as one of your hairs is thick. So these little flakes of graphene, we call them, are very, very small. Now, does anybody in the audience have a degree in math? All right. So if you do, there's a question you might have in mind, and a question that was actually already asked to me by a member of our audience, which is, aren't they just 3-dimensional materials that are really thin? They're not actually 2-dimensional. And the answer to that question is yes, but in the way that I care, no. So physically, they do technically have a thickness that exists. It's, as I show in the diagram, very, very thin, but it is possessed of some thickness. However, in terms of electrons, electrons need a little bit of space to move around, electrons being the primary component of electricity. And because those electrons need space to move around, and a few atoms thick is not enough space for electrons to move in that direction for quantum mechanical reasons. If there's any point in this talk where I say something and you ask yourself, why is that? Just push your glasses up your nose, say, it's a simple side effect of quantum mechanics, and do not think any further, please. The net result of this is that in 2D materials, electrons can only move in 2 dimensions. So from the perspective of electrons, since they're confined in that thin dimension, they are truly 2-dimensional, and there are some serious physical consequences for that. So basically, in a 2-dimensional material, electrons are restricted to moving in a plane here. Oh, I have a laser pointer, I forgot about that. And then in a 3-dimensional material, electrons can move around in any direction they want to. So the comparison that I, for some reason, chose was that in a 2-dimensional material, electrons are like elephants in a field where they can move forward, backward, left, and right, while in a 3D material, electrons are like frogs in a pond. They can move up and down and left and right and forward and back and however they want. All right? So that's all fun. But first of all, people want to know how to make them. And it turns out that was a really difficult question to solve. So people knew about graphene in particular, and 2-dimensional materials as a concept for decades and decades and decades, like mid-1900s. However, they were not able to make them until 2004. And in 2004, Andre Geim discovered how to make graphene, and it won the Nobel Prize in Physics only 6 years later. That's a very short gap. This is considered one of the biggest discoveries of this century in physics. Won the Nobel Prize in 2010. And the way they did it was not with like molecular beam epitaxy or physical vapor deposition or any of the word salads that we normally use for making materials. The solution was Scotch tape. I am just as embarrassed as you are about this. A lot of the time when I tell people, other physicists, that I work with graphene, they'll ask, oh, so you fold Scotch tape? And they're joking. We still use Scotch tape. That's still the state of the art for us. Some other fun facts about Scotch tape. 3M won't let us know what's in Scotch tape. It's still proprietary. We don't know what it's made of. And my advisor told me that when you peel Scotch tape, it emits a very small amount of X-rays. And we don't know why. I think 3M does, but I sure don't. So let's talk a little bit more about this and why the Scotch tape method, as it's called, works. So first of all, what you do is you take graphite, you put it on a piece of Scotch tape, you fold it on itself a bunch of times, and you can be really rough with it, you can be really aggressive, and it's fine. And then you place it on something flat, like this little slide here, it's just a piece of silicon. And then you peel it off, and little pieces of graphite, and when you look very closely, little pieces of graphene will wind up sticking to that slide. And then you have graphene. Congratulations. So the reason it works is because graphite starts out as a bunch of layers of graphene all stuck to each other. And tape just takes those layers of graphene and peels them off. It works because graphene is naturally sticky, and even after you've peeled the graphene off, it stays sticky. And other two-dimensional materials can use this same method, and those other two-dimensional materials also stay sticky. Fun fact, the force that causes them to be sticky is called a van der Waals force, but it's probably easy to remember as it being what makes geckos stick to walls. It's the same thing, so these materials are all using the same basic principle as gecko toes. And the net result of all this is you have a class of materials that are all naturally sticky and stick to themselves and one another very easily, which means, resultingly, these are basically just little Lego bricks that you can stack on top of each other. In most fields of physics, if you want to make something, it's very complicated and very prone to disorder and all sorts of issues. With us, we take one thing and we put it on top of another, and then we call it a day. And the fun thing about this is you can mix and match them, and whenever you take two new materials, you created something new. And it also changes even if you just change the angle between them. One of the advantages over this compared to Legos is that you don't need to align them first, so it's actually a little easier than Legos too. And so what this basically means is there's a bunch of very easy experiments you can do just by taking one 2D material and placing it on top of another. So we're working with Legos and Scotch tape. And it feels a little childish to me. So in our lab, we're working with metaphorical Legos, but we are also working with literal Scotch tape, many different kinds, toothpicks, paintbrushes, hole punch, nail polish, come on, work with me, there we go, floss, a cabinet made to hold construction paper for an elementary school classroom. This was the only thing I could find that could do what I needed. Velcro, and an Xbox controller. That one I did have to explain to the purchasing office. They were not fond of this purchase. So, let's take a pause for a second. In summary so far, 2D materials are very, very, very thin. There's a bunch of different types, and you can combine them together just by putting one on top of another. All right? So, the next question is, what do we do with that? And the first answer I have for you guys is you can just fundamentally destroy the laws of physics. So, first of all, in traditional physics, there are two different types of particles. And those particles exist in 3D. They can also exist in 2D, so like frogs, they could be on land or in water. But it turns out when you go to 2 dimensions, there's a third one. And it's only in 2 dimensions. And we call them anions, which is not the same thing as anions. So if you're a chemist, I'm sorry to disappoint you. This is one of the worst named things in physics, in my opinion, because if I ask people about them, they assume I mean the other thing. It's really tough for me. And let's talk a little bit about anions in particular. So, some fun facts. First of all, as I said, they only exist in 2 dimensions. They, like elephants, can remember their history, which I cannot possibly explain in this PowerPoint. Like elephants, this metaphor is starting to break down a little bit. But also, unlike elephants, their memory makes them useful potentially in quantum computing. Little fun fact about quantum computing, by the way, if you ever see in like a 60 Minutes bit or like Time magazine a picture of a quantum computer, what you're looking at is the thing that gets the computer cold enough to work. The computer itself is actually very small. All of this is just a fridge. And this is what I research. So it was mentioned that I study 2D materials in very cold temperatures. So I study the kinds of systems that we're using to search for anions, because they don't exist readily. You have to look for them. And so in my applied physics degree is kind of towards quantum computing, but I don't mess with it a whole lot myself. However, there's also a bunch of different things we do with 2D materials. Another big one is regarding superconductivity. So superconductivity is just what happens when you have a material that electricity can flow through when there is 0 resistance at all. It's a really interesting phenomenon, and it's actually really useful in a lot of people's day-to-day lives. So an MRI, the giant magnet in an MRI uses superconductivity to create a magnetic field that high. Pretty much any magnet uses a superconducting coil. Now, the fun thing about this is that it turns out if you take 2 pieces of graphene and put them at the right angle, it just becomes a superconductor. We literally call it the magic angle. It's about 1.1 degrees. And that was definitely the biggest discovery in condensed matter of the 2010s. And one of the biggest discoveries in physics of the 2010s. Some other stuff that we can do in this field, the rest is going to be a little bit more scattershot and a little more applied. So 2D materials, as I mentioned, are often bendable, so we can make bendable electronics with them. A lot of people are looking at using graphene in biosensing. Graphene also has some applications potentially as a water filter. It turns out if you just punch some little holes in graphene, it's great for filtration. There's a lot of batteries that use graphene, and there are all sorts of other different microelectronics that are made possible because 2D materials, as you can imagine, are very thin and very lightweight. And so there's a lot that you can use 2D materials for. A lot of it is theoretical, mostly, or baseline experimental right now. But right now, it's a very, very big field, and we're very hopeful that we're going to get more use out of them. Anyway, I would like to thank, first of all, Applied Physics. I would like to thank my lab mates, 2 of whom are in the back row. And I would like to thank Relate for helping me set up this talk, and the Ann Arbor District Library for paying for my drinks tonight. Okay, so questions?
Yeah, so the Xbox controller, did you have to make your own microscope to be able to see?
Yes, you pretty much got it. So I assembled a microscope with a little robot arm to stack the 2D materials on top of each other. And the Xbox controller is for controlling the little robot arm. They're actually not too difficult to see under a microscope, but I did like buy some components for a microscope for that specific part. Okay, one more question. Whoa. Okay, some of you can come and talk to me later. Go ahead.
Can you hold it in your hand? What's it feel like holding it in your hand?
So if like a 2D material, just in general, holding graphene in your hand feels like holding the thing that graphene is on in your hand. Graphene is so small, you'll never be able to feel it unless it's so big it's graphite. So usually we store graphene on just like those little slides, like I showed a few slides back, and you can't even see it with the naked eye most of the time. All right, so we are out of time, but if you're curious to hear more, please come talk to me, and thank you, everybody.
Joseph Essman, everybody. All right. Thank you all so much. Thanks, Joseph Essman, excuse me. Thank you. And Buddy Stark for his great talk, and Samuel Friedman before that. Thank you all for being a great audience at Nerd Nite. I wanted to tell you that we will be here again next month, so if you had a good time, please come back on, I think it's March 14th. Come to, you can search us on the internet, and it's right there. It's right there. It says? Where? Somewhere. Oh, at the bottom. Yeah, exactly. And Nerd Nite at Ann Arbor, or annarbor.nerdnite.com is our website, so you can get more details on the speakers for next month as well. Thanks a lot, everybody. We'll see you next month.